everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new Mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you have never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. But anyway, this week we are going to be talking about the solved case of Damilola Taylor. He was a 10-year-old boy who had dreams of becoming a doctor one day and saving lives. However, his life was tragically cut short when he was attacked one November evening over 20 years ago now. And it took just under 6 years and three separate trials for his killers to be brought to justice. So for today's case, we are going back to the year 2000 in Peckham, which is an area in South London in England. However, Damilola's story actually begins in Lagos, which is a city in Nigeria in West Africa. That's where Damilola was born on the 7th of December 1989, and it's where he spent the first 10 years of his life. Damilola's parents were called Richard and Gloria Taylor, and he was the youngest of 3 siblings. He had an older brother named Tunde and an older sister named Bemi. Damilola, who was also often called Dami by those that knew him personally, was described by his father Richard as being a very lovable young boy. Everyone just loved Damilola. He was very rarely seen without a smile on his face, and his smile always lit up the room. He was very positive, very carefree, he was sensitive, he had a good sense of humour, and he liked playing games and taking part in activities. But his father Richard also said that Damilola was far from an ordinary young boy. He wasn't too much like other boys his age because he was very wise beyond his years. Just from the way Damilola acted and behaved, you would have thought that he was older than he was, because he really related to older people, elderly people in fact. He really liked talking to elderly people. And Damilola's dream for when he was older was to become a doctor. That was his career goal because he wanted to help people. And he even wrote a poem about his ambition to become a doctor and how he wanted to change the world. By all accounts, the Taylor family were a happy little family of 5. Richard had a good job working as a civil servant. I think Gloria would stay home and look after the kids, and they had a good life. Damilola had a good childhood. However, in the year 2000, life for the Taylor family would change completely when they actually had to just pick up everything and move from Nigeria to the UK. Now, Richard and Gloria Taylor had actually lived in the UK before, years earlier, in like the mid-70s to mid-80s. According to one source, they lived in West Uxbridge in London for about 10 years, and that's where they had their first 2 children, Bemi and Tunde. However, they moved back to Lagos in Nigeria in the mid-80s, and a couple of years after that is when they had their 3rd child, Damilola. So unlike his siblings who were born in England, he was born in Nigeria. And as I said, the family were happy in Nigeria. However, in the year 2000, they found themselves in a situation where they were kind of forced to move back to England. You see, Damilola's older sister Bemi had epilepsy, a very severe form of epilepsy, and she needed treatment and medication. However, back in Nigeria, the family were really struggling to pay for this treatment. It was so expensive, and I actually read on one article that Bemi's medication was costing her father Richard an entire month's wage, and they just could not afford that. Obviously, most families would not be able to afford that. However, as I said, Bemi was born in Britain, so because she was a British citizen, that meant that she was entitled to receive free treatment in the UK on the NHS, and she really needed this treatment. Her epilepsy was so severe that it meant that she was unable to walk, and so the family knew that they had to go back to England to help her. Richard Taylor actually couldn't go with his family. He had to stay in Nigeria because he still needed to earn money and work. So he stayed there whilst the rest of his family, so Gloria, Bemi, Tunde and Damilola, all moved to Peckham in South London in August of 2000. They lived in a small flat on the North Peckham estate where one of Richard's relatives lived, and this relative had agreed to let the family stay with them for a while. And this was a huge lifestyle change for the Taylor family because Peckham at this time in 2000 was not the nicest of areas to live in. It was quite a dangerous place to live, to be honest. Some people said it was even one of the most dangerous areas in London. There was a lot of crime going on, a lot of youth-related crime. There were a lot of gangs, a lot of drug use, and it was an area of poverty. The majority of people that lived in Peckham would really struggle financially. So it was a big adjustment for the Taylor family. They were used to living in a 4-bedroom house with their father in Nigeria where they felt safe and happy, but now they were living in Peckham in South London. But despite this massive change, Damilola himself was settling in quite well. He continued his education at a new school in South London. He joined the Oliver Goldsmith School and he seemed to really enjoy his new school. He really liked playing football there. Specifically, he liked being the goalkeeper. He was making new friends and he was even hoping to become one of the school's prefects one day, which, if you don't know, a prefect is kind of like a senior pupil in the school, a pupil who is given a bit of authority and has more responsibility. Prefects are usually the best behaved students and their role is to represent the school and provide a positive role model for the other students. And that's exactly what Damilola wanted to achieve. He really wanted to be a prefect. And as well as making friends at school, Damilola was also making friends with a couple of other young people that lived in the same area he did on the North Peckham estate. Damilola really liked living in London, and for the time being he didn't want to go back to Nigeria. He was actually due to go back to Lagos after 3 months of living in London. His father said that he could stay with his mother and siblings in Peckham for a short while, but then after about 3 months he would return to Nigeria and continue his education there. But Damilola really didn't want to do that. He wanted to stay at his school in South London because he felt that there were a lot more opportunities and advantages to going to a school in England than there are in Nigeria. For example, his school in England had computers, which his school in Nigeria didn't have, and he was really loving being able to use them and access the internet. And so his father said that Damilola could stay in England for now with the rest of the Taylor family. However, even though on the whole Damilola was really enjoying his time in London, he did start to experience some bullying, and I think this started about 2 months after they first moved. As I've already touched on, Damilola was very ambitious. He had dreams of becoming a doctor and he really liked school. Whereas a lot of kids were very much like, oh yeah, school sucks, it's boring, Damilola was like the complete opposite. He really enjoyed learning. He was very studious, and I think some of the kids would mock him and make fun of him for that, and they saw him as a nerd, which to them was a bad thing. Although this bullying didn't just happen in school, Damilola also experienced a little bit of bullying and harassment really outside of school too. You see, most weekdays after school had ended, instead of just going straight home, Damilola would go to the local library in Peckham because I believe he attended a computer club that was held there. And once he had finished at the library and he began walking home to the North Peckham estate, he would often be approached by groups and gangs of young boys who would shout at him and try to intimidate him. And they would even try to persuade 10-year-old Damilola to join their gang, but Damilola was not interested in that kind of thing, and so instead they just picked on him. However, in November of the year 2000, this harassment and bullying stepped up a major level and took a very dark turn when Damilola was attacked one evening whilst he was on his way home. It was Monday the 27th of November 2000, which was obviously a school day for Damilola, so he had been at school that day and by all accounts he had a good time. He enjoyed enjoyed going and learning new things as he always did. And then when school finished that afternoon, he headed just around the corner to the Peckham library, again as he usually did, to attend the computer club. He was at the library for a little while and then eventually he left and he began his journey home. And by this point it was starting to get dark outside because it was November. However, the journey home only took a couple of minutes for Damilola, and it was a walk that he was very familiar with as he had done it several times before. But on this particular day, Damilola never reached his destination. He never made it home. Not too long after Damilola left the library, his mother Gloria started to worry a little bit because he hadn't arrived home yet, and usually he would have been home by now. So she left their flat on the North Peckham estate and she started walking along the route that her son walked along every single afternoon when he was on his way home. She probably assumed that she would come across him at any moment. Maybe for some reason on this particular day he was just running a little bit late. However, that isn't what happened, because when Gloria began approaching a road called Blake's Road, she actually came across a crime scene. She noticed that there was a load of police tape sectioning off like an outdoor stairwell, and there were police gathered around it, around this stairwell. So Gloria approached one of these police officers and she asked what was going on, what had happened, and the officer replied saying that a young boy had been attacked. And instantly, as soon as he said that, Gloria just had this gut feeling that it was her son, Damilola, because she was out looking for him. He hadn't arrived home yet, so she just thought that it must have been him. And it was him. Damilola was that young boy. He had been stabbed in the leg by someone whilst he was just innocently walking home. Damilola had been found just collapsed in that outdoor stairwell, at the top of the stairwell, and he was just bleeding out. And he was discovered there by a man, a member of the public, who sat with Damilola and rang 999. And this man could tell that this was very, very serious. Damilola was in a very critical condition, and he knew that if he didn't get some help soon, he would not make it. But despite that, despite how very serious this situation clearly was, this man actually said that Damilola looked up at him whilst he was in his arms bleeding out. He looked up at him and he said, quote, "I'm okay, I'm okay." But it turns out that those words, "I'm okay," would actually be Damilola's last. By this point, I think a couple of people had come across the scene and they also sat with Damilola so that he wasn't alone whilst they were waiting for help to arrive. And as I said, the emergency services were called, so I will play that phone call for you now.
Can you send an ambulance to Blake's Road? SC15? Yeah, SC15, yeah. It's a boy bleeding to death. Right. He's actually bleeding to death. This boy is approximately about 12 years of age. He has lost a hell of a lot of blood.
Yeah, how has he done that? What happened?
We do not know, sir. We've just come out and found him on the staircase. He tried to climb up with his
Right, where's he bleeding from?
He's going. He's in a...
Where's he bleeding from?
We cannot tell.
As soon as the paramedics arrived at the scene, Damilola was taken straight to the hospital for treatment, and doctors tried their absolute hardest to save his life, but sadly they were unable to. His injury was just too severe because the stab wound had actually severed his femoral artery in his leg. So he had lost a hell of a lot of blood, and at 5:47 p.m. he was pronounced dead at just 10 years old. Following this, his family received the news that Damilola had passed away, but obviously his father Richard was still in Nigeria at this point, and so now the rest of the Taylor family had to break the awful news to him whilst he was thousands of miles away from home. I believe the one who actually told Richard the news was Damilola's older brother Tunde, and at the time Tunde knew that his father would have been in work, so he rang his works directory director's office number, which I think was like the head office. And when Richard was told that he had a phone call in the director's office, he was really confused because he was just like, well, why didn't they ring my office number? But they said to Richard, they need to speak to you now, immediately, it's very urgent. So Richard answered the phone call, and when he did, he was told the news that his youngest child, Damilola, had been killed. And Richard says that he doesn't really remember anything after this phone call. It was like after he was told the news, everything was just a massive blur. He was actually in such a bad state that he collapsed and he had to be taken to the medical centre to be treated because he was just in so much shock. Following this, Richard obviously returned to the UK to be with his family, and as you would expect, this case, Damilola's case, received a lot of media attention. A 10-year-old boy was just murdered as he was innocently walking home from the local library, so the story really grabbed the attention of the public and the media. 10 days after Damilola's death, the family held a memorial service for him, and this took place on what would have been his 11th birthday, the 7th of December. And during this memorial service, Damilola's older brother Tunde spoke on behalf of the family, and he talked about how proud he was to call Damilola his little brother.
My life can never be the same without you again. I have always wanted a brother to be there with me, that I could ask a question and he could ask questions from me too. Share each other's things, and above all, someone I can proudly call my brother.
And Richard says that again, he doesn't even really remember the memorial service because he was just still in so much shock that everything to him was just a blur. Following Damilola's death, the police of course set up a murder inquiry, and the first thing they needed to do was work out what had actually happened here. What were the events leading up to when Damilola was found bleeding to death in the stairwell? How did he end up in that stairwell? So to work out a timeline, the police went back to the beginning and they had to look through CCTV footage in the area to see if they could spot Damilola on any of it, and they did. As we know, Damilola had been to school that day, and after he left school he headed to the Peckham library, and he was caught on CCTV just outside of the library. He was playing outside of the library for a short while. He was just skipping and jumping around as children do, and then he went inside. He stayed for the computer club, and then afterwards he left the library and he began his journey home to the North Peckham estate. But as we know, he never made it back home, and at some point along his route he was attacked. Now, it was quite difficult for the police to actually piece together what exactly happened to Damilola because there isn't any CCTV footage of the actual attack, and I don't believe at this time there were any witnesses. They didn't have any witnesses come forward, which is something we will talk about a bit more in a little while. But yeah, so because they didn't have either of those, CCTV or witnesses, it was a struggle for them to work out what had happened. But after going over the evidence that they did have, the police kind of came up with their own theory as to what they think happened to Damilola that evening, which I will go through now. So as I said, he was caught on CCTV after he left the Peckham library and he began his journey home, and the police think that he was very, very nearly home when the incident happened. He was only about 400 yards away on Blake's Road, and it was on Blake's Road that the police believe Damilola was approached by a gang of young boys, of teenage boys. And according to one article I read, they believed this because they received information from a member of the public that said they saw 3 young boys just outside of the stairwell where Damilola was found around the time that he was attacked. So anyway, the police theorized that he was approached by a gang of 3 young boys, and as I mentioned earlier, this wasn't unusual for Damilola. There was a lot of gang activity in Peckham at this time, and he was often bullied and harassed by these gangs whilst he was on his way home. But on this particular day, he was approached by a gang. They completely surrounded him, and the police think that they tried to steal his silver jacket. jacket that he was wearing, the one that he is seen wearing in the CCTV footage. But Damilola said no, he refused to give it to them, and this clearly angered the gang, because after this, one of the gang members, grabbed a broken glass bottle that was on the floor and he stabbed Damilola in the leg with it, causing a very, very deep wound and severing Damilola's femoral artery. And this broken glass bottle was later found by the police just on the ground about 20 yards away from the scene, and Damilola's blood was on it, so they knew that this was what had been used to stab him. This was the murder weapon. Following the stabbing, the teenage boys left the scene. They just left Damilola on his own whilst he was bleeding profusely. Now, once the boys left, Damilola actually managed to continue walking whilst he was still bleeding, and he was clearly trying to find someone to help him. So he started walking up the stairwell where he was eventually found, and as he was walking up the stairs, he was leaving a blood trail behind him, and just as he got to the top of the stairwell, he just fell to the ground. He collapsed. He couldn't walk any further because of his injury. And it was not long after this that member of the public, came across the blood at the bottom of the stairwell, and he started following the blood trail. He followed it all the way up to the top of the stairwell, and that is where he found Damilola. And of course, we know what happened after this. An ambulance was called. Damilola was rushed straight to the hospital, where soon after he was pronounced dead. So that is what the police theorized were the circumstances surrounding Damilola's death. And so now the hunt was on to find this gang, find the boys that did this to him, and bring them to justice. One of the first things the police did in this case was they began conducting door-to-door inquiries. They basically wanted to speak to every single person that lived in the area and ask them if they had seen anything or did they have any information regarding the identity of the attackers. And they also did a public appeal for witnesses, but this resulted in very, very little leads, because it seemed as though the local community didn't really want to cooperate. They didn't want to help the police because they didn't trust them, to be honest, especially like the black community, because of how the Metropolitan Police had handled previous cases of black victims. The Met were actually called out for being institutionally racist, and in the aftermath of that, people were just not willing to help the police in any way. They had zero respect for them, and so when it came to Damilola's murder inquiry, no one came forward. No one wanted to help the police, whether that was because genuinely no one knew anything about this murder or because they did and they just didn't want to help the police. We don't know, but regardless, no one came forward. But it was also suggested that another reason why they received little leads was because obviously it was believed by the police that the people who did this to Damilola were part of a gang. It was a gang of young boys, and there is always this fear in true crime cases where gang activity is involved. There's always this fear that people in the local community feel, because they think, well, if I snitch, the gang might come for me and kill me as revenge, because gangs don't deal well with snitches. So maybe someone, a local, did know the identity of the person or people that did this to Damilola, but they were just too terrified to tell the police. But despite this silence from the public, in the weeks following Damilola's murder, the police did actually arrest 11 people because they thought that they might have had something to do with this case. However, every single one of them, all 11, were eventually released, because although the police had their suspicions, they had no evidence to charge them with anything, and so they had to be let go. The police continued working on this case for months and months. As I said, they were appealing to the public, they were doing door-to-door inquiries, they had police officers posted all over Peckham who were not only trying to get information from the locals, but also trying to reassure them and make them feel safe and hopefully prevent another attack from happening. But despite everything they were doing, Damilola's case itself wasn't really progressing in any way. They still had no suspects and virtually no evidence to go on. But then suddenly, in June of 2001, about 8 months after Damilola's death, the public and the media were stunned when the police announced that they had actually arrested and charged, not just arrested, charged 4 young boys with the murder of 10-year-old Damilola Taylor. And the reason they were arrested and charged was because not long before the arrest, a 14-year-old girl came forward to the police and claimed that she had actually witnessed the stabbing. She saw Damilola get stabbed. Now, I don't know the name of this 14-year-old girl because obviously she was a minor at the time, although one source I read said that she was referred to as Bromley a lot. But she came forward to the police and she told them that she was actually on Blake's Road when Damilola was attacked, and she saw the 4 boys that did it, that surrounded and attacked Damilola and then left him for dead. And on top of that, she was even able to give the police the names of the boys because I believe she actually knew them. They weren't strangers to her, so she could tell them their identities. But they also couldn't be named by the police because they were also minors. All 4 of them were under the age of 18, so their names were not allowed to be released to the public and the media. I believe 2 of the boys were 16 years old, and I'm not entirely sure how old the other 2 were, but they were younger than that, younger than 16, so they were all children. But yeah, this 14-year-old girl said that these 4 boys were the gang that attacked Damilola. She saw them do it, and so they were all charged. All 4 of them pled not guilty to the murder charge. They all said that they had nothing to do with it, and so the case had to go to trial. And the trial began on the 30th of January 2002, about a year and 2 months after Damilola passed away. However, this trial was honestly a complete mess because, well, for starters, the 4 boys that were actually on trial for murder were not acting at all like they were on trial for murder. It was clear that they did not understand the seriousness of this situation that they were in, probably because they were so young. A reporter who covered the entire trial actually said that the boys were treating this whole thing like a school trip because I think they were just like joking around and stuff. They didn't seem to understand that they were in a court and were potentially going to be convicted of murder, the murder of a child. So that was a big issue, but the main reason why this trial was such a mess was because of the 14-year-old girl, the girl who claimed that she witnessed the murder. You see, the police and the prosecution's case relied very heavily on this girl's statement, actually pretty much solely on this statement, because the only evidence they really had linking these 4 boys to the crime was her account of that day. They didn't really have any other evidence connecting them to Damilola's murder apart from this girl who said that they were the ones that did it. But of course, that's not really solid evidence because perhaps she was lying. And the defense actually accused her of doing just that, of lying and making it up in an attempt to get a £50,000 reward that had been offered by Crime Stoppers, I think, in exchange for the identity of Damilola Taylor's killers. So yeah, the defense argued that she was just lying about witnessing the murder in an attempt to get the reward money. And they also accused the police of inducement, of bribing her essentially, because during this whole time from when she first went to the police with her version of events up until now when she was telling her version of events in court, she had been given quite a few items by the police. They brought her some new clothes, they brought her a mobile phone, they were gifting her quite a few things, and so the defense argued that they were doing that to try and bribe her. They were basically saying that the police had said to her, oh, say this in court in your statement and we'll get you some new clothes. Say this and we'll get you a new phone. Obviously, we don't know if that is true. We don't know if she really was bribed by the police, but her whole account was just unreliable, really, because although we don't know for certain that it is what happened, it could have happened. But what made it even worse was that this witness didn't carry herself very well in court. Of course, she was only 14 years old, but if you're giving evidence in court, you don't want to give the jurors any reason to doubt you and doubt your story. But this young girl was doing exactly that, really. She was very mouthy, very rude. She kept getting angry towards the defense team when they asked her questions that she didn't like. And she even admitted lying to the police in her interviews. I'm not sure exactly what she lied about, but she admitted that she wasn't always completely truthful with them, and she just kept changing her story repeatedly in court. And so, like I said, she really could not be trusted, and the judge agreed. And on the 27th of February 2002, the judge, Mr. Justice Hooper, ruled that her testimony was unreliable. And so the whole case against these 4 boys just collapsed. 2 of the boys were acquitted and the other 2 were found not guilty by the jury. And what we do know now for certain is that those 4 boys were innocent. This case is solved, so we know who did it. Wow, you guys will find out later on in the video, but yeah, it wasn't these 4 boys, so it seemed as though this young girl really did lie. But of course, at the time when the case collapsed, the police and Damilola's family were devastated at the verdict. I can't imagine how emotionally draining it must have been for the family to think that finally, after about 2 years, they might get some justice for Damilola, but then the case just crumbles before them and they are back to square one. But despite this huge setback, they refused to give up hope. They were still so determined to get some answers and find out who did this to Damilola. But also the Taylors wanted to do more than that. As well as getting justice for their son, Richard and Gloria wanted to make a difference. They wanted to help others, young people especially. They could see the situation in Peckham and other areas in London where, as I said, there was a lot of poverty, a lot of gang activity and a lot of violence and crime, knife crime. And they wanted to try and stop that because their son was taken from them as a result of this violence, and they wanted to make a change so that hopefully this would not happen again to another young person like Damilola. And so in May of 2001, just 6 months after their son's death, they set up the Damilola Taylor Trust as a memorial and lasting legacy for Damilola. And I think the trust really helped Richard and Gloria with their grief. It gave them something positive to focus on whilst the police were still working on the murder inquiry and trying to solve it. But I will tell you guys a little bit more about the trust and the kind of work that they do towards the end of the video. Going back to the case, as I said, the Taylors absolutely refused to give up hope, and so did the police, to be honest. They were still so determined to bring the killers to justice. And so since they didn't really have any new leads to investigate at this point, they decided to just go over old ones. In an attempt to hopefully identify some suspects, they were going to go over every little thing again. So every piece of evidence they had obtained so far, every tip and lead given by the public, every single person that had been arrested and let go as part of the investigation. And when they did that, they did identify 3 new suspects. It was 3 young boys. Well, I say new suspects, but they weren't actually, because these 3 boys had been arrested before. They were 3 of the 11 boys that were originally arrested soon after Damilola's death in December 2000. But at the time, the police had to let them go because they had no solid evidence linking them to the crime, or at least that was until now, until this point, because in early 2005, they were arrested and charged with Damilola's murder after the police found forensic evidence that implicated them. Now, these 3 boys were all a part of a gang in Peckham called the Young Peckham Boys. The first boy was named Hassan Jihad. He was around 14-15 at the time in 2000, at the time of Damilola's death, but now by this point he was 19. And the other 2 boys were actually 2 brothers named Danny Preddy and Ricky Preddy, who were 12 and 13 at the time of the murder, but by this point in 2005 was 16 and 17. Ricky was the older brother, so he was 17 and Danny was 16. But despite how young they were at the time, just 12 and 13, these brothers actually had a criminal history. They both had a history of violence and assault and theft. Just as a side note, the two brothers, Danny and Ricky, were not actually allowed to be named by the police when they were charged. The police couldn't give their names to the public or media because they were still under the age of 18. But Hassan Jihad was 19, so his name was given to the media. But yeah, that part isn't too important to the case because we know their names now, but I just thought I'd let you know anyway, because a lot of the articles written at the time will obviously not have the boys' names in them. But anyway, as part of the decision to go over everything again, the detectives looked into all of the 11 boys that had originally been arrested in the case in December of 2000, and they decided to take a closer look at 3 of the boys, Hassan Jihad, Ricky Preddy and Danny Preddy, just in case maybe they missed something there. Maybe these 3 boys that were a part of a gang in Peckham did have something to do with Damilola's death, but they just didn't have the evidence back then to show that. Perhaps if they did a bit of digging into the boys now, they would find some. So as well as sending off the evidence they already had in this case to the forensics lab, such as the broken glass bottle and Damilola's clothing that he was wearing that day, the police searched the 3 boys' homes and sent pretty much all of their clothing and footwear to the lab too, to see if they could find any DNA evidence on any of it. And they did. Even though it was like a couple of years later by this point, they did find some forensic evidence. On a pair of Danny Preddy's trainers, they found a 9mm blood stain, and when this blood was tested, it was found to have come from Damilola Taylor. Danny Preddy had the murder victim's blood on his shoes. But the evidence didn't stop there. They didn't just find evidence pointing to Danny, because on one of Ricky Preddy's sweatshirts, like the cuff of his sweatshirt, traces of blood were also found, which again, when tested, were determined to have come from Damilola. So that was proof that these 2 boys must have been involved. They must have had something to do with Damilola's murder, because how else could Damilola's blood have gotten on their clothing? Now, from what I can gather, scientists didn't find traces of Damilola's blood on any of Hassan Jihad's clothing, although they did find some fibres on his clothing that were an exact match to the clothing, I believe specifically the jumper that Damilola was wearing on the day that he died. And these fibres were also found on the Preddy brothers' clothing. And in addition to that, fibres from the 3 suspects' clothing were also discovered on Damilola's clothing. So that proved that there had been fibre exchange between Hassan, Ricky and Danny and the victim, Damilola. This fibre exchange proved that they had each been in contact with him, been near him, touched him around the time that he was killed. So this proved that they were all at the scene. So now the police had evidence linking all 3 boys to the crime, and it was enough to arrest and charge them with murder. And so that's exactly what the police did in January of 2005, and in the following May they all appeared in court and pled not guilty. Despite the evidence, they were denying all involvement. And so that meant that a trial had to go ahead, and about a year later, after they were charged in January of 2006, the trial started. However, this trial was also a bit of a mess, just like the last one with the 4 boys, because again, the police didn't have huge amounts of evidence really. During the trial, the prosecution did bring forward a couple of people who actually claimed that the Preddy brothers had confessed to them before, confessed that they stabbed Damilola. So the prosecution brought them in so that they could give their account of these confessions in front of the jury. However, the defense were able to just pull the witnesses' accounts months apart during their cross-examinations, so it made them look untrustworthy. So really, the only evidence the police had was the forensic evidence, the fibre exchange evidence and the blood evidence, which was good evidence. However, the defence had actually thought of a way to try and explain it. The defence knew that they couldn't claim that the boys had nothing to do with Damilola's death because of the forensic evidence, but they tried to argue that the boys shouldn't be up for murder, they shouldn't be charged with murder, but for manslaughter, because Damilola's death might have actually been accidental. The defence claimed that no one actually stabbed Damilola that evening in November of 2000. None of the three boys picked up the broken bottle and stabbed him with it. They believed that what actually happened was that the boys were arguing and fighting with Damilola, hence the fibre exchange, and that one of them pushed him, and this led him to falling onto the broken glass bottle and sustaining the injury to his leg. And I believe this theory about Damilola falling on the broken glass bottle was actually put forward in the first trial, the trial of those four boys, and so the defence used it again in this one, and they even brought in a medical expert named Alistair Wilson, who was the clinical director at the Royal London Hospital, and he said that he believed that that could have been what happened. He said that there is a chance that Damilola could have been pushed and he fell onto the glass rather than one of the boys actually picking it up and stabbing him with it. So this made it really, really difficult for the prosecution, because even though a lot of people, the majority of people, believe that it was murder, that one of the boys physically stabbed Damilola, they couldn't necessarily prove that, because the defence even had an expert saying that he could have fallen onto it during a fight, which would technically be manslaughter because the boys didn't mean to kill him. And so following this, in April of 2006, 19-year-old Hassan Jihad was cleared of all of his charges in relation to Damilola's death, and 17-year-old Ricky Preddy and 16-year-old Danny Preddy were cleared of murder. Now, I believe the reason why Hassan Jihad was cleared of all of his charges was because he didn't have any of Damilola's blood on his clothing, he just had the fibres, but the fibres again didn't necessarily prove that he was involved in the attack that led to Damilola's death. So he was cleared of everything, whereas Ricky and Danny were just cleared of murder because the jury couldn't decide on whether or not to convict them of manslaughter. And so this trial also collapsed, and it was decided that there would be a retrial. The Preddy brothers would have to go to trial again so that another jury could decide on the verdict. The Preddy brothers' second trial began on the 23rd of June 2006, and they both pleaded not guilty to the manslaughter of Damilola Taylor. Once again, it was argued that the boys were just involved in a fight with Damilola, and this fight resulted in one of them pushing him and he fell onto the broken glass bottle, which severed the artery in his leg and caused him to die. They argued that the boys didn't mean to cause Damilola's death, like they hadn't gone to the scene armed with the bottle. They didn't plan to stab him. It was just a fight that got out of control and Damilola fell. And the jury agreed with this apparently, and at the end of the trial in August of 2006, both boys were found guilty of manslaughter. And when the jury reached the verdict and they read it out, Ricky Preddy actually started shouting abuse at the jurors. He was clearly very angry at the outcome of the trial, and he shouted, quote, "You are corrupt, you are nothing." After the verdict, Richard Taylor gave a statement outside of the court, and he said, quote, "We, the family, feel nobody can ever return our son to us, but it is a great comfort that justice has finally been done for Damilola. We pray that his gentle soul can now rest in peace." For their convictions, the brothers were sentenced to 8 years each, and that's not even prison, 8 years in a normal prison. That's 8 years in youth custody because obviously they were under the age of 18. Of course, as you would expect, a lot of people, including the Taylor family, were very disappointed and angry at the sentences. 8 years for the life of a 10-year-old is incredibly low, but the judge, Mr. Justice Goldring, explained his reasons behind these short sentences, and his reasons included the boys being only 12 and 13 at the time of the attack, so they were very, very young, and also there was no evidence to suggest that they brought the glass bottle to the crime scene with them. It was already there, and there was no evidence to indicate that they planned to kill him. It wasn't a premeditated attack. So yeah, they were sentenced to 8 years in youth custody, but neither of them actually served their full sentence. Ricky Preddy was released on the 8th of September 2010, just over 4 years after his conviction, so he served about half of his sentence, and his brother Danny was released the following year in 2011. From what I could tell, Danny has stayed out of trouble since his release. He has not been arrested for anything since this, but it's a different story for Ricky. He has been in trouble with the police constantly over the years. I believe he was sent back to prison in March of 2011, so less than a year after he was released, and he was sent back because he breached the terms of his release. You see, when he was released on parole in September of 2010, he was told that he was not allowed to go to Peckham again, and he was not allowed to associate himself with gangs and gang members. But he just ignored that. He did both of these things, so he broke the terms of his parole. So he was sent back, but then he was released again in January of 2012. But then as soon as he was released, he did the same thing again. He went back to see gang members in Peckham, and so he was recalled again. He spent another few months in prison, and then he was released in July of 2012. And I think he's been in and out of trouble with the police ever since. He's been arrested several times over the years. In fact, just last year in February of 2020, he was sentenced to 4 years in prison after he was convicted of a few different charges. He was convicted of driving whilst disqualified, driving without insurance, failing to stop, and causing serious injury by dangerous driving. And that last one, causing serious injury by dangerous driving, was because he drove his car right into a female police officer, and she was very seriously injured, but thankfully she did survive. But he was sentenced to 4 years for that, meaning that he is still in prison right now. And that is it for this case. That is the case of Damilola Taylor. But before I end the video, as promised, let me just tell you a little bit more about the work that the Taylor family did in the aftermath of this case. So like I mentioned earlier, in May of 2001, Richard and Gloria Taylor set up the Damilola Taylor Trust as a legacy for their son. The trust's mission is basically to help young people who are susceptible to gang crime and knife crime. They basically want to support the same kind of young people like Ricky and Danny Preddy, because Richard Taylor argues that young people who get involved in crime are also victims, because often those that do get involved in crime are the children who have lived in poverty and have been abused and have had terrible, terrible childhoods. I mean, we see it all the time in these cases, don't we? More often than not, when we talk about an offender's background, we always talk about how their upbringing was really, really bad. And whilst that's not an excuse for what they do, it does show us what kind of led them down the path of committing crimes, if that makes sense. So Richard Taylor believed that something needed to change. Young people that are victims of terrible upbringings and terrible childhoods needed more support so that hopefully they can be prevented from making bad choices and becoming involved in a life of crime and a life of violence. And that is exactly what the Damilola Taylor Trust does. They support young people, vulnerable young people. They support youths that are feeling a little bit bit nervous and unsure about their future, they provide them with some advice and guidance. They try to ensure that young people stay in school and do well in their education. They help them find work and get good jobs. They just want to support young people that have been raised in bad environments and hopefully influence them to make good decisions and good choices so that they can grow up to become successful and independent adults. Richard and Gloria Taylor also set up the Damilola Taylor Centre in memory of their son, and this is located in Peckham in South London. And there are so many things that young people can do there. They have some incredible facilities. They have a sports hall, they have a dance studio, a football pitch, games consoles. They hold so many activities there, such as arts and crafts, cooking, sports tournaments. Honestly, there is so much that children can do there. And the hope is that this will bring young people in Peckham away from like getting involved in gangs and crime, and it will influence them to just have fun and put their time and energy into something positive like playing together and having a good time at the centre. And in November of 2020, to mark the 20th anniversary of his son's death, Richard Taylor also set up another organisation called Hope 2020, which is basically a campaign to support and celebrate and shine a light on the achievements of young people. Richard Taylor actually has an OBE for all of the work that he has done since his son's death, and I just think he and the rest of the Taylor family are incredible. They have done so much to try and make a difference and provide support for young people, and it's all in Damilola's name as a legacy to him. Unfortunately, Damilola's mother Gloria did pass away about 7 years after her son's death in April of 2008. I believe she suffered a heart attack and she passed away as a result, which is so sad. Yeah, sad note to end on, but as I said, the work that she achieved alongside her husband Richard is just amazing and so inspiring, and Richard continues to do that work to this day. But yeah, that is it for this case. That is Damilola Taylor's story. I will leave the Damilola Taylor Trust website linked in the description below if you would like to learn a bit more about what they do. They do accept donations to help fund everything that they do, so if you would like to make a donation, I will leave that page linked below also. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on the case in the comments. Also let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please do give it a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Molly. Bye guys.